So hello, thank you for joining us for this last session. I will speak in English because Gal doesn't have translation, and if I speak in Spanish, it's going to be very complicated. So we have this last session that we decided to have in a more like freestyle, you know, and in order to, on the one hand, have a conversation with Gal Kirn and Jonathan Harris, but using some footage and fragments. We thought at the beginning to pass a film, but the conference is so full that finally we made a selection, the three of us, and so the session is called Sequences of Struggle and Utopia. And why? Well, we didn't want to address neoliberalism without thinking what kind of resistance is possible, you know. I think for us it was important and to have it at the end of this first day, which is full and everybody is very tired. But we wanted to address the possibility of utopia in a moment of complete disarticulation of the social sphere. But there was something that this morning Nancy said, no, the fact of creating a void, eliminating the history of resistance. And actually, I think during and this is, I think, the topic of the fragments we selected, there has been a possibility of resistance, even if it was fragmented and disarticulated. And yeah, it's interesting to think that because neoliberalism, as we were talking about this morning, is a moment of complete presentism without future. So how can we, when we say that it's easy to imagine the end of the world and the end of capitalism, the end of neoliberalism, at the same time it is clear that it's completely exhausted, and the COVID time is evident, no? And how the COVID forces even several states, the most neoliberal, to implement some kind of semi-socialist solutions. So we wanted to address the possibility of resistance also in different territories. So we decided to talk about how resistance could happen in a place of strong implementation of neoliberalism. Chile was one example, but ex-Yugoslavia is another example. And for talking about that, we have Gal with us online. And then you will see as the fragments also talk about the UK situation, another place, another avant-garde of neoliberalism path. No? So we will do the following. I will present you my two speakers with me, and then they will have time to do a first presentation of 10-15 minutes, and then we will see the fragments of what? Well, we will present around 20 minutes, I say, the documentary Pathways Through Utopia. It's a document, a film produced in 2008 by Isabelle Fremont, John Jordan, and Kypros. And you will see we will see two sequences. One in the UK in the struggles for climate change and defending Heathrow, based on the Heathrow airport, but also in ex-Yugoslavia. And the other one we will see is, or a little, just really a small part, and I think it is a very relevant film for this conference, The Old School of Capitalism in 2009. So there is just, both were done in the same moment, at the same moment, which is an important moment, no, after 2008, the economic crisis that put into question the neoliberal project clearly, no, by Selimir Silnik. I don't know if I'm pronouncing right, Gal. So that actually deals with the neoliberal transition in Serbia, and we will show a small part of several demonstrations and the contradictions of which path we should take, no? And so I invite you to watch the movies and the films, the whole, that you can see online quite easily. But I hope the selection that we made is interesting enough for a discussion with Gal and Jonathan, but also with you here, and because it deals with, I think, several questions that we were talking about today. So before giving them the floor, let me just introduce. I will start by with Gal, because he will speak first. And Gal Kirn holds a PhD in intercultural studies of ideas from the University of Nova Gorica, and he has been working in several universities in Ljubljana and in ICI Berlin, and he has a strong work done on Yugoslav partisan art, but also he's editor of Beyond Neoliberalism, Social Analysis After 1989, and so he will give us an overview to understand best the selection of the fragments that we selected. And Jonathan Harris, that you know already because he was chairing one session today, is Emeritus Professor of Contemporary Art History at the Birmingham City University and professional fellow, at the University of Creative Art at Canterbury, England. And so, he has been writing about almost everything, so whatever, I don't know, about modernism, this was the beginning, but a lot on globalization and contemporary art. And he also is from Britain, so, and you were living at the time, of the of the structural changes of Thatcherism. And so so I'm very happy to have you both here, and even if Gal is at home, but with us. And thank you very much for wanting to discuss with me about the possibilities of resistance and the possibilities of futures and utopias. So Gal, you have the floor. Thank you for your 15 minutes presentation. Thank you.
Do you hear me okay?
Perfect.
Okay. If I shout too much, try waving. I see only Paula and Jonathan. So thank you for having me, to Paula and organizers and Macba to host the event. And I must say, I regret, or that I'm really sorry not to be there. Some work familial obligations could not work this time out. And I'm still waiting for my first in-person bigger event, probably 2 weeks later in Vienna. But I could follow some bits and pieces via YouTube today in the afternoon, and the previous session, which was also a little bit in Spanish, so I could understand a bit, but not so much. Anyways, Paula already made a nice introduction. And I would say that, important decision why to select was that these both films come in precisely these historical moments, 20 years after the Berlin Wall, and with first serious cracks in neoliberal political, economic, and especially cultural ideological hegemony that was always presented as there is no alternative. And then what happens is like strikes, occupy, rebellions, riots. So there is a whole sequence from 2009 to 2015, let's say 5-6 years of like kind of opening and kind of this end of history proclamation, right? So one film is a documentary, engaged reportage on different islands of utopia, also very paradoxical cases. We will watch one from UK, one from Serbia, while the second film is from Želimir Žilnik. He's our post-Yugoslav partisan filmmaker. I mean, he always makes movies in a partisan way. And it's a kind of typical docu-fiction, departing from real historical events and then going through very different, discussions and political organization, people taking over the factory or one corporation, then going to the farm. You go with this bunch of anarchists, anarcho-syndicalists, and some theorists, and they are also learning through the process and so on. So it's, and it also doesn't romanticize any of these agents. So yeah, that's a couple of typical Gilles features in his movies. But I will not speak about film so much. I promised like a little bit longer introduction on two processes that I'm thinking or pondering about also in my book on partisan ruptures of Yugoslavia. So first kind of long story that I'm interested in is some kind of specific but also ambivalent, not so clear relationship between utopia and dystopia, like thinking through capitalist, socialist, post-socialist condition, and then kind of emergence and duration of something I call post-socialism, which cannot be yet identified with neoliberalism, but opens the door to it. So these are 2 points or 2 fields that I want to open, and you probably already touched some of these topics in the early sessions. So first few words on utopia, dystopia. In the post-Yugoslav context, at least there is often this dualistic and even nostalgic viewpoint. Socialist past is presented as utopian, and then neoliberal present as something dystopian. While for those in power, the constellation is reversed. So there is a turn taking socialism as something as a totalitarian dystopia, right? On the one hand, and on the other side, the present that they live in, that we live in, is the realization of dreams of nation under the invisible hand of market. Frederick Jameson, also important reference when thinking about postmodernism and different, transitions within capitalism, has performed this groundbreaking analysis of what are the features of the postmodern. And one of his main hypotheses is that the time and dystopia, or kind of temporality, that the time has kind of being vanished, and that the space and dystopia are becoming kind of dominant and reign supreme over the modernist trope of, let's say, certain utopian time and so on. So dystopia is a kind of spectral defense and reflection on state socialism. It's a kind of also failed utopian project of the 20th century. But of course, Jameson is more interested in, let's say, also politico-aesthetical analysis of different novels, of different films, science fiction, and so on, through which he kind of builds this argumentation. On the other side, and more recently, somebody like Andreas Malm tries to kind of repudiate or kind of criticize Jameson's earlier remarks. So, as you know, Malm is interested a lot in climate change and global warming, and says in interesting fashion that global warming or climate change is a evident communication with our past and burning of fossil fuels. And I would add, where the nature and time are now taking revenge over that type of postmodernity that was dominated by a certain space or something that is devoid of nature and time. One can very well say that both Jameson and Malm agree on one point. So that much more and much worse of dystopian future is coming. And if we do not start imagining and enacting once a kind of collective utopia, or in Malm's words, he has some kind of solution of eco-Leninist politics. One could think that the plan, thinking kind of democratic planning, is one of the most utopian things today. So to return to initial argument about neoliberalism, that is now seen as this kind of dystopian, extractive present, especially after the crisis of protest strikes, but nothing really changed, right? Or even the worst has come. One should highlight that it was highlighted already in introductory letter, I think quite importantly, that neoliberalism still succeeded to articulate for some time a strong, let's call it entrepreneurial utopia for many of the dispossessed, or at least precariously employed, self-employed. So on one side, promoting this negative trust organized around the distrust of the state and its taxation regimes, social security, while on the other side, there is this affirmation of promoting what we know, the market, free self-management or self-managed individuals, entrepreneurs that guarantee the happiness or are also made responsible for the failures. So this type of ideological trope was particularly strong in the former East, but also in part of Latin America. And the results of kind of pandemic, post-pandemic life testify to this. So this type of neoliberal governmentality and ideology, the mantra of distrust of the state, somehow magical healing powers of individuals outside of medical system. If you look at the rates of vaccination, you have a split on the Iron Curtain again. But this does not speak of certain socialist dystopia, lack of education, lack of democratic legacy or something, but this is precisely a realization of neoliberal utopia. So that's like how I read this kind of the criticism, always again this barbaric, backward East Europeans that don't have anything, but it's basically a part of a really a dramatic ideology that's been, taking place much more brutally in the 90s and so on. So this is like the first point that I wanted to make. And then when we think or act seriously in the former East context about the real collective utopian impulse, we are either relegated deep in blood and bold and fascist ideologies, or we are relegated to the argument of gulags. As Alain Badiou, for example, showed, there is a certain intellectual blockage, embargo to think beyond the status quo. So for some time, there was a refuge in part of art institutions and so on, speaking about certain progressive nostalgia, right? Thinking about history of avant-garde, thinking about certain socialist experiments as well, and so on. So, but I think that, and these films kind of testify to it, that around 2010, that kind of sequence is over. So, there are much more serious attempts to think, to act, and organize against neoliberalism, but also kind of this authoritarian, what was always there, the authoritarian neoliberalism has become our reality now. So let me say something about the second point, about the longue durée of post-socialism. Many people take not 1989 for Yugoslav context, but 1991. This is the breakup of Yugoslavia. So Berlin Wall falls in Yugoslavia much more brutally, democratically. Democratic transition is actually a complete failure and a catastrophe. So some people also take 1989, which is one of the most dramatic, years in socialist Yugoslav history. I mean, there are many dramatic years, but this one, in terms of like the end of not just socialism, but also end of Yugoslavia. So on one side, you have this huge strike of miners in Trepče. So this is Albanian part, like say Kosovo, which is autonomous, used to be autonomous region. So you have people being underground and making huge strike and rejecting to go to the daily light for days and days. And also like kind of response of kind of Milosevic take over of power and this kind of mystification of the 600 years of the Battle of Kostovskoye, which kind of also announces a clear-cut solution for the end of Yugoslavia. For me, post-socialism, I read it not as something that has temporal coincidence with the end of Yugoslavia in 89 or 91, however you want to claim it, but something that was actually starting already in socialist Yugoslavia itself. So my hypothesis is, and here I kind of am very near to assessment of Boris Budin, who was more working on different films, but assessment from my side kind of comes from political economic analysis of socialist Yugoslavia. Right, 1965, you have a huge market reform in Yugoslavia that kind of makes competition or market criteria as the most important criteria. There is competition between enterprises, you have emergence of commercial banks, you have competition between workers and non-workers, and unemployment rising. You have the first neoliberal attempts of the Gastarbeiter, so guest workers that are still state managed in Europe or European project, which bring workers from south of Europe and even from Turkey to kind of do the dirty jobs or the jobs that nobody else wants to do. And of course, it's completely flexible. It's really bad conditions. It's much less paid and so on. So it's like a kind of test ground for later neoliberalism that is happening then from the 90s and so on. So but 20 years before, it kind of happens in this dynamic. So this is one point. Of course, post-socialism as such is not yet neoliberalism. Some would argue, like you have a theorist like Johanna Bockmann. She tries to trace the intellectual history between self-management model of Yugoslavia and certain neoliberalist currents. Right? You would say she would point to certain conferences or intellectual roots. You know that Yugoslav self-management was a specific type of socialism, which had very strongly inscribed this anti-state moment. So kind of withering of the away, not just of capitalism, but withering away of the state. So that was something compelling for some theorists in economy and some neoliberals. But of course, Yugoslav socialism remains socialist and in a very different temporality also in the global market and so on. But importantly, you do have first coalitions, political, ideological coalitions between nationalists and neoliberals in late 60s, which are defeated in the beginning of 70s, but nevertheless marry again in the 80s, late 80s, and win and bring the federation down, but also end with socialism. So this is a little bit kind of how the preparation to transition to hell has been made. One has to still say that neoliberalism does not take place in the 1990s in post-Yugoslav context. In very limited cases, yes, but it's kind of delayed. There are two reasons for that. One reason is ethnic wars. So you have not economy, that is this last instance that is defining the transitions in social formation, but it's actually ethnical or nationalist ideology, or what I call certain primitive accumulation of memory, right? So it's a whole kind of symbolic violence, the destruction of monuments, rehabilitation of fascism, and you know, this kind of 1,000 years old supposed dreams of nations and nationalities coming true. which actually, are posited, like in Macedonia around Alexander Great, in Slovenia about Karantanja, which there was no Slovenian language or something more than 1,000 years ago and so on. But yeah, this is a little bit, the process of understanding the post-socialist transition or kind of condition is not just the critique of political economy, but one has to also go through critique of historical revisionism, for nationalist ideology, and kind of combine these two axes that have been for a long time separated by methodological or ideological borders, if you want. One other point of this historical revisionism, and I will end very soon, is that we are a lot of times making fun of certain twists in American kind of neoliberalism, or kind of the MAGA of the Trump, make America great again. But one has to be very clear that in the former East and in the post-Yugoslav context, we have our own dosage in the early 90s of make Slovenia great again, make Croatia or Serbia great again, and also make Germany great again. Reunification of Germany as such is a very nationalist project, and it also defines certain kind of geopolitical orientation of Europe. So this is the moment where we are kind of selling the future to financial speculation. All we have is speculation about the past. So this is I won't go into the details of that, but it's just important to know that neoliberalism does not happen in the 90s because Yugoslavia known something like social ownership, social property. So this is not a state property, state ownership, but only in the 90s, the property of people, of workers, of society was nationalized. So what we get is like a proper state socialism in the early 90s. And you would have this typical crony tycoon capitalism. So through the webs of this clientele with political parties, you would have very untransparent processes, who becomes the owners and capitalists for different funds and so on. And starting major layoffs and also like then later through privatization, sales cheaply of the infrastructure and factories that were built during the socialism. So it's only in 2000s when Slovenia, Croatia kind of come closer to European integration, and when Milosevic in Serbia is toppled by protest, that the way of neoliberalization starts. So this is basically the movies that we will see are kind of testament to this phase of kind of real neoliberalization. And this also brings, as you can see, a very strong kind of disorientation for a lot of people. You will see some workers being very nostalgic, some workers being still dedicated into that, and some people speaking from very nationalist also positions and so on. So that's a part of certain kind of postmodern, post-socialist conditions, and Žilnik kind of goes in the middle, in medias res, so to speak, to confront these ideological formations. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. And so right now, Jonathan, you have 10 minutes, I would say, because we want to have time to watch the movies.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not convinced these.
Jonathan, you need to.
Not convinced these thoughts cohere, but I will try and pursue them anyway. Trying to start off by thinking something upbeat and optimistic to say, that being part of our mission. And the only thing I could come up with was recently reading an essay about Sebastiano Timpanaro, the Italian philosopher and Marxist. There was a recent essay in New Left Review, an unpublished essay by Perry Anderson talking about Timpanaro's work in the 70s. He claimed that human happiness and misery, it must be said, emotionally isn't bound by social conditions. In other words, they are relative biological constants. This goes back to some very interesting, perhaps now controversial debates in the 70s. But the constants he was talking about were things like the joys of having children, sexual pleasure of all kinds, feelings of love and attachment. And Timpanaro argued that even in the most imaginably dire social circumstances, these joys and fulfillments are not denied to people. So neoliberalism hasn't robbed and cannot rob people of their humanity. Just in case we thought it had or could. Incidentally, it's a theme that's dealt with, I think, a lot in D.H. Lawrence's novels. The attempts to describe working class experience in some of those novels from the early 20th century. Okay, so now back to miseries and difficulties, but two further anecdotes about the clash between intellectual critique and experience in some ways, I suppose. One of them is about a recent Guardian and trade union report on 0 hours contracts in British universities. I don't know whether you followed this in the Guardian, but two of the worst offenders for 0 hours contracts, the University of Birmingham, not my university. The University of Birmingham is a £1 billion institution. It's an enormous place. And the University of Edinburgh. Two, in other words, of our best research-intensive universities, and they are the worst offenders in terms of employing part-time academics on 0 hours contracts. So you can bet that they're partly using those people to replace researchers on the faculty who are researching neoliberalism, whatever else they're up to, and they're being brought in on 0 hours contracts to do their teaching, essentially. And it's how the British system really how it funds research is by bringing in underpaid people on those sorts of contracts. So that's a bit miserable, isn't it? So we've already gone downhill a bit, haven't we? The other thing I wanted to mention, because you were talking about experiences, and I did go to university in 1980, just after Thatcher was elected. And I found myself on a student union demonstration in Eastbourne, if anyone knows Eastbourne, in East Sussex, in 1981, when the Conservative Party conference was in Eastbourne that year. And we were all hanging around outside the conference centre in Eastbourne, waiting for Thatcher to arrive with her entourage, because nothing happened. But then there was a rumour that she would be turning up around the corner. So some of us went round the corner to a completely anonymous street. And it was very odd. Suddenly, Special Branch arrived. They cleared the street, and several black big cars turned up. And Thatcher got out of this car to wave and greet some old age pensioners. And I met her. I was as close to her as could I think of anything to say. I actually found it a very disturbing experience. It was the cold, steely blue eyes that looked at me, and I could not think of anything to say or do. It was a very interesting, strange experience. The second one, another oddity, but in a very different direction, was 2 or 3 years later, when I'd started doing a PhD, I went to hear Raymond Williams talk at the ICA. He died in '88, so he wasn't long to live. And he was actually talking about the beginnings of the impact of what we now call neoliberalism on the Arts Council of Great Britain, as it was in those days. And I was completely overawed by him as well. And he was in the bar. If you know the old ICA in London, he came out of the auditorium a bit like this and went to the bar to order a drink. And he was completely by himself. And I was too shy to go and say hello to him or to think what I might possibly say or ask. I just give you those anecdotes, and I'm not quite sure what they really mean, actually. But I do think they are about this clash between how we can understand things intellectually in our social experience on a day-to-day basis. So just a couple of other points to make. Shut me up when you think I need to stop, Paula. One of the things I was thinking about today and yesterday was what are or were the attractions of neoliberalism to ordinary people? In what sense was this packaged? And I think going back to the late 70s in England, it was a notion of freedom, and I suppose agency as well. And that ties into the particular previous 10 years of British history in the 70s, which I could talk about a bit in a minute. But another example of how this this ideological kind of understanding clashes with experience. A few years later, in the 80s, Thatcher came out with this plan to stop any education around homosexuality in British schools, if you remember this. It was called Clause 28, I think. And it was a really important moment in the mid-80s when a lot of people who may have economically seen personal benefits to, to deregulation and privatization, but whose social liberal life was suddenly brought into question by Thatcher's conservatism. And it actually, I think, led to her demise, that moment, and to a very different political culture in the Conservative Party now, which you might say is another example of assimilationism, around gay rights, for instance, and all those sorts of issues. But that was an intensely contradictory moment in the late 80s, within late Thatcherism. So Stuart Hall, of course, was analysing this very early on, even in a way before Thatcherism. But his term authoritarian populism, was one that we might think about now as being something we might need to, to bring out of the cupboard again. Thatcherism and the Crisis of the Left, The Hard Road to Renewal, that book was called, if you remember that, from 1982. So I've been talking about the clash between ideas, critique, and social experience, authoritarian populism. I think there is the danger of what Stuart Hall also called culturalism. Again, it's going back into the 70s, actually, or a voluntarist account of how we try and deal with neoliberalism. In other words, it was and is a powerful, aggressive economic, political, and military formation. David Harvey called it appropriation by dispossession. It's not a nice thing, and it's not an intellectual process. It's about people's bodies and lives, as we know, being destroyed as well. So I think the dangers of voluntarism and of intellectual critique are still important to consider now. I noticed the title for the conference, Counter-Revolution, presumes a revolution. And of course, I was wondering which revolution or revolutions we might be talking about there. And I think what this tells us is that we have to deal with different regional, national, social contexts to understand how what we now call neoliberalism interacted and interlocked with particular cultures and peoples and traditions and situations in different countries. And that certainly happened in England as well. In other words, there's no pure neoliberalism. It's the way it locks into what traditions and practices and histories are at work in certain countries. In Britain, in England, there certainly wasn't a revolution against which neoliberalism was acting. The post-war period after 1945 was a bodge that we now call social democracy. And it emerged in a very haphazard, disorganized way. It wasn't a concordat or agreement or anything like that. It was a kind of constant renegotiation, but it went on for 20 or 30 years until the mid-70s. It was corporatism. It saw the expansion of the welfare state, and it was also about the relative power of working class people as well, economically. So it wasn't, again, about ideas necessarily or ideologies. It was about practical struggle in all sorts of ways. And it lasted, but was exhausted in a way by the mid-70s, partly because of the British Labour Party and its utter failure, morally and intellectually, to actually have any idea of what socialism means. And that's still the situation that we find ourselves in. But yes, I think Thatcher, and if you read a lot of the interesting stuff from Naomi Klein, it's clear that Thatcher and the neocons were revolutionaries in the sense that they had a specific ideological program. And she was talking to people in America and in other places, not just in the States, about what this meant, actually. And it was, for instance, the miners' strike in 1984. That was a specific plan to break the miners' union. And it was premeditated. They built up the coal stocks to make sure that the miners would be broken over a year. They stopped paying benefits to miners' families on the basis that they were receiving strike pay. So there's absolutely no doubt about it that the miners' strike was a completely premeditated, planned, and successful destruction of the miners of the NUM. Getting more miserable, isn't it? I'll finish in a minute. I'll finish in a minute. This is also not a positive point. Neoliberalism in the 1980s wasn't new or liberal. Something that David Harvard said. You may have seen a recent book, brilliant book by the anthropologist called Dan Hicks, who works at the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, called The Brutish Museums, the Benin Bronzes, Colonial Violence and Cultural Restitution. It's just come out. And it is about the British destruction and murder and looting of Benin in West Africa in 1887. It's a history of which British people know and are taught virtually nothing, actually. But it shows, as you probably all know as well, that up until the mid-19th century, the British state was very happy to hand over colonialism to private companies and their own armies. And that's precisely the people and the organizations that murdered, we think, hundreds of thousands of people in West Africa in the second half of the 19th century. And it was done by the Germans and the Dutch and the French as well. And it was done in the British context by private organizations with the support of the British government. Dan Hicks calls this World War Zero. What happened in Africa in the second half of the 19th century? And I think that really does put paid to the idea that what we call neoliberalism in the 1980s was either new or liberal. So I'll stop at that point.
See the two fragments. We will see first is around, I think, is 27 minutes all. Is one fragment of 21 minutes from Path Through Utopia, and then immediately we will watch like 7 minutes from the Old School of Capitalism. Okay, so if you si podéis poner las pelis, gracias.
Hopla.
In theory, you can only go back to the time machine and what the time machine the first bit. That's right.
Wow, that's...
It's really important that as we deal with the necessities and the huge scale of the changes that are needed, that we remember that we have to keep dreaming about the world that we want to create, because only by keeping our focus on that horizon will we be creating the world that is actually better than this one. And that combination of dreaming and determination to fight is what's going to carry us through.
Right, okay, I'm Chief Superintendent Mark Ricketts. I'm the Tactical Commander here at the moment, and I'm making a very polite request on behalf of the owner of the property for you to leave. I take it you refuse.
There's four crucial things about the camp. Firstly, we're upfront about the necessity for a social movement. Secondly, we criticise and fight against the capitalist growth economy. Thirdly, we are recognising that corporations have stolen a lot of the agenda around climate chaos, that it's still their power in the media that's driving a lot of the discourse, and that we ordinary people need to take the discussion, the debate and the answers and the solutions back. And lastly, that we're here and we're having a good time and we're featuring on the front pages because we've got the passion and the excitement that's going to make the difference in the long run. I think what's more and more necessary is that we withdraw consent and our participation from the current economic system, and there's no single answers about how that's done. That's down to every single person to look at their role in the economic system and start saying, how the fuck do I get myself out of this? And fast.
Very well planned, I must say. Maximum secrecy and minimum discovery.
It was kind of agonising wait for the call to go.
Everyone tuned in to like defeating climate change, and they just suddenly realised that they all had to be in the path of the third runway proposed at a certain time, and suddenly we were here.
And they tried to keep us in the vicinity of Heathrow and stop the whole camp, and you can't use the law like that. They tried to get the largest injunction in British legal history to stop us, and we won. And so all they said is that you can't do anything illegal within the bounds of Heathrow for this month. Which it's already illegal to do anything that's illegal. That's why we have the word illegal to describe those illegal things, because they're illegal.
Climate change campaigners have spent the day planning for tomorrow's day of direct action at Heathrow Airport.
For now, the camp remains peaceful, but with hundreds of people arriving each day, the potential for trouble is rising.
I mean, basically, this camp is set up on the site of the third runway.
Police are saying there's a hardcore criminal element to the camp.
This growth economy on a finite planet is just absurd. It's just not possible.
We are a direct action group, so we've been very clear that this is one of our aims, and it is necessary sometimes for people to step out of line to deal with great issues and great threats. This is what climate change is.
Sorry, who are you filming for?
The climate camp.
Scotland Yard has said veteran campaigners have infiltrated the camp, and that could lead to confrontation.
The problem for police and passengers is that campaigners aren't saying exactly what they'll do or when.
This was extremely well planned, and they cut their way in using bolt cutters. And once that segment of the fence was lifted out, they just streamed in.
Dozens of climate protesters are on the run following last night's direct action at Heathrow Airport. 114 were arrested at the scene and charged with criminal damage after they dug up the runways to plant trees.
flights from Heathrow Airport have been cancelled. According to authorities, 114 arrests have been made, but scores of activists remain on the run.
La transition, c'est-à-dire que le problème, c'est que on connaît le point A. Et normalement, la transition, il y a le deuxième point aussi, le point B. Et on ne le connaît pas, le point B, en fait.
The markets have plummeted still further on the news after a day which had already brought stock markets around the world close to paralysis. The crisis that started in the United States has swept through Europe, felling banks in France, Germany, Holland, and here.
Ajde, koliko žara, toliko pravde u ovoj zemlji, nema aviona da se vrati. Koliko valica, toliko radnika.
In my world, they say self-management doesn't work. It's inefficient. Workers can't run a company. What would you say to people who say that?
Ja sam menadžer godine. Ja, kod nas se pokazalo da mi možda upravljamo. Znači, sasvim ono suprotno. I bolje upravljamo nego i onaj menadžer što je bio i što je drugi kupio. Znači, kod nas je to sasvim, to ste ja možda ste i vidjeli u firmu, ali znači, bio si u fabriku, treba da snimaš.
Poznavajući tadašnju situaciju u društvu, ljudi kada su krenuli u štrajk, meni je to lično delovalo kao utopija. Bila je bezizlazna situacija da se, tako reći, borba Davida protiv Golijata. Kada je sad taj jad i čemer prošao, ušli su u fabriku, mislili su da neće znati šta će da rade sa fabrikom, kako će pokrenuti, pogotovo što je to specifična proizvodnja farmaceutska. Oni su i tada, pored štrajka, sve te probleme rešili i pokrenuli proizvodnju.
Ali među vama ima što kaže doći?
Svi.
Svi Ma sada ne liče na štrajkače.
Nisam ni ja. Ja, ali nisam ja. 3 dana. Evo ja sam bio. Još imam posljedice.
Šta je drugačije? Drugačije je osjećaj neke slobode, nekog novog entuzijazma, poleta. Ja sam 34 godine u Jugoremediji, nikad nisam imao takav osjećaj da mogu i slobodno i da kažem svoje probleme i da sa mnogo većom voljom pristupim rešavanju nekih problema. I mnogo sam slobodniji da zahtevam za svoj delokrug posla.
Znači, Jugoremedija je začetnik protesta radnika. Znači, nama je mnogo lakše ovog trenutka zato što imamo njih. Oni nisu imali nikoga.
Ovo je sve u prevodu čista pljačka koju je omogućila država i sistem. To je to. Znači, radnici ostaju bukvalno na ulici, bez ikakvih prava i bez obeštećenja, bez ičega. Znači, 500 porodica je uništeno. U jednom potezu 500 porodica na ulici. To je to. To je delo te privatizacije. Sad smo ušli u fabriku, nećemo više da izađemo dok ne dobijemo odgovor od državnih institucija šta će se dogoditi sa nama, bukvalno. Tako se borimo. Borimo se za svoje prava i za svoj deo fabrike. Ne izlaskom iz fabrike.
Kako se osjećate to što ste okupirali fabriku?
Nismo okupirali.
Nismo okupirali, smo samo ušli zato što je ona i naša, nije samo njihova.
49% naša.
49% je naša fabrika. Nismo mi nju...
Ne naše, 2000 akcionari u fabrici.
I osjećamo se bolje, pošto ćemo verovatno ovim putem nešto ispuniti.
Samo da vam kažem da ovo radilo 120 godina. Da su bili Turci, Austrija, Kraljevina, komunizam. I nikad nije uništeno. Kada je došao ovaj tranzicija, opljačkana.
Znači ima sve, znači dosta sam ponosni sve to što se tiče ovoga, što smo se vratili nazad i drago mi je što i druge fabrike gledaju u nas da se vrate isto onako u onome sistemu koji smo mi bili. Da žive, da se vrate fabrike svim tim ljudima nazad, što se ugledaju u nas i oni počinju, vidim da narod je počeo već da radi mozak, da razmišljaju glavom svojom dokle da stignu. Ušao u fabriku i prvi put kad sam stao posle 3,5 godine na svoje radno mesto. Znači, ne znam, nisam mogu da verujem da sam tu. Nisam mogu da verujem da sam tu, da to nisam radio nekada. Da vam kažem jednu stvar, mnogo sam sretan. Ima sve. Ali mislim da je dovoljno, neće biti niti.
Iscrpljujuće.
Od prethodnih dana u protestu ispred kapije isto niko nije reagovao od nadležnih i kolege su donele odluku da zbog nereagovanja države, jednostavno mi za njih nismo postojali i rešili smo da preležemo kleštima katanac i uđemo unutra. I tu smo i danas. 4. mesec.
What's the chances of you winning?
50-50%. Pola-pola. Na ta smo.
Ostali smo bez ikakvih prava. Mnoge kolege po izlasku iz suda, veoma kivni i žučni, su želeli da dođu i da upale firmu.
She explained.
Yeah, because of the decision of the court, many of the people that were on the court wanted to come here and burn the factory.
Today?
Today, after the court, yeah.
Fuck. Wow.
And what did they do? Did she have to talk to them so that they would not do it?
Kako je vaš stav povodom toga što su oni hteli Beograd?
Ja sam zamolila da sačekaju Beograd, ako ne, kaže, palit će se sami, za njih je život gotov.
Momče, vidimo se ili u proizvodnji ili na kapiji sa kantama benzina.
Ja bih u proizvodnji.
I ja.
Ja bi volila.
Svi.
Država je korumpirana i gotova. Mi smo ovako mali.
Ali veliko srce.
Veliko srce. Ne damo se. Ovako se čvrsto držimo. To nas održava.
je dobro, ali nedovoljno radikalno i da se razumemo na pogrešan dan. Prvomajski praznik se održava 1. maja, a ne 29.
Ostavite radnike da žive od svojih bednih plata, jer mi smo ti koji punimo budžet Srbije. Dole vlada!
Treba promeniti sistem, treba srušiti kapitalizam i ponovo uvesti socijalizam.
Protiv kapitalizma, samo napred.
Tako je, samo socijalizam. Srušit ćemo kapitalizam. Kad ga budemo srušili, onda će radnici imati svoja prava.
Sve su uzeli, čoveče, jesmo imali... Pa komunisti...
Pa Titova žena nema čega da živi.
Ajde, pa jesu oduzeli sve.
Kome? Kome su oduzeli?
Dunđercu jesu oduzeli zemlju. Zašto su? Mom dedi, samo nešto da vam kažem.
A kome su dali? A kome su dali?
Narodu.
Pa narodu su dali.
A šta je narodu radio? Prodo, da bi dobio...
Kome prodo?
Da bi dobio penzije. Da. Još kako je Tito delio parcele ratnicima.
Dobro, ajde ga. Ja sam belocrkvanin. Just moment. Englezi kažu. Ja sam belocrkvanin kolonist. Sin sam nepismenih roditelja. 8 dece majka je izrodila. Završio sam vojnu akademiju. Majku sam je učio da piše i čita. Ali, svi smo mi se školovali besplatno. Danas zub ne možeš da izvadiš bez para. Dalje, kao dete nepismenih roditelja, završio sam vojnu akademiju. Višu vojnu akademiju, ratnu školu, pravni fakultet, magistrirao, engleski završio. Recite mi gde to može u kapitalizmu dete nepismeni roditelj da se školuje besplatno i da postigne to.
Dajte ljudi da spasimo Srbiju i da ima narod za hleba. Mi ni za buđav hleba nema. Mi smo ovdje trebali da počnemo himnu buđav lebas, bre. Nema narod šta da jede, bre.
Sve je to jasno.
Ali nemoj da mi se vraćaš na Tita i na ove zebanci i na komuniste i na ovo. I ovi su zebanci, nisu seli u fotelje, počeli su da kradu ko svrake. Evo ti ga moji direktori. Takvu divnu firmu su propasili, dobro i temelji borave tamo u Kruševcu, koliko su krali, bre, čoveče, ko svrake. Čiča, da mi je rođeni brat u vladi, da moje dete nema da jede, ja ću da se bunim i tačka, završeno priču.
Ej bre, pa ja sam u Kruševcu 5 godina bio.
U Abeho, ja čudim imaš neke zastarale zajebane stavove. Što je bilo, bre, daj se borimo da izranimo decu i zajebi.
U Indiji ima 50 miliona organizovanih komunista, 150 miliona u Indiji živi u socijalizmu, u Kini ima 75 miliona komunista, cela Kina je danas 3. ekonomska sila na svetu. Da smo mi ostali u socijalizmu, danas bi bili mnogo jači i ekonomsko i socijalni nego mnoge evropske zemlje.
Ne treba da se vraćamo na ono staro što je bilo.
Koje staro?
Na komunizam,
pa
na besplatno školovanje.
No na šta?
Nema bolje, treba kapitalizam. Svugdje u svijetu kapitalizam je uspeo. Svugdje u svijetu je uspeo.
Gdje je uspeo?
Svugdje. Šta je u Nemačkoj, šta je u Americi? Socijalizam.
Jel u Americi, ali imaš u Americi besplatno školstvo? Nema. Jer Srpci idu na fakultete? Ne idu. Jel idu engleske radnice, ne idu na fakultete.
Ali kako stoji u Americi, a kako mi stojimo?
Pobili 50 miliona domorodaca. Kolonije držali 100 godina. Pljačkali, lopovi sad zato su obogatili.
Slažem se.
A mi smo 70% nepismeni bili.
Ajde sad vi meni objasnite, vi ste stariji, ja vas poštujem.
Da.
Kako to ta Nemačka u pičku materinu...
Znaš zašto? Ima sad 15 miliona nezaposlenih.
Sad ima trenutno.
Pa kako to?
Inače,
dobro, ajmo te polako.
3 rata su izgubili.
Da ti kažem. A Somalija je isto kapitalistička pa se umire gladi dan danas. 100 godina kapitalizma u Somaliji.
Znate šta, kako se...
Venezuela, Bolivija, pa ne.
Naprimer, ne treba društvenu imovinu. Pazite, ja sam došao iz Srbobrana.
Tamo smo srušili...
Ako se ne budeš borio, ništa nećeš uraditi.
Tamo smo srušili u Elanu, u Ratarstvu, srušili smo jednu halu.
Dobro.
Gazda nam je ostao dužan, 2 godine nas nije plaćao. Podelili smo cigle.
This is the selection that we made with Gal mostly. So right now we have, I think, yes, 20 minutes. So we thought to have some minutes of reaction from Gal and Jonathan, and then we open to the floor. Okay. So Gal, in a synthetic way, in order to maybe, do you hear me, Gal?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, so can you, a short reaction?
Yeah, very shortly, because we already did a bit more general introduction to the post-socialist condition. First of all, Yugo Remedia, the case, the positive, so to speak, utopia becoming the reality. I just want to say a few things about the history. So 2002, privatization starts, and these workers, what we see now as a successful takeover of that plant and production line was a result of 5 years of strike and resistance by workers. So they really fought a long fight. And they actually won also against their previous boss, who was doing a lot of corruptive things, but he also left a lot of debt for Yugo Remedia, for this company. And importantly, they were working like in this self-managed way for 4 years, and then in 2012 they went bankrupt. So it's just important to say that after 2012 they went through 14 different takeovers of like different owners, different funds, and last 3-4 years the production line has completely stopped. So that's a little bit of this utopian, dystopian story going on in Serbia. Just that you know where it stands. If you're interested for that, I can also give you some other articles or references. And secondly, about Žilnik film that we saw now at the very end. So society goes through a really dramatic transition, privatization, neoliberalization, and there is basically no discussion about it in the society. This is already decided, is the deal done. Workers get on the streets, or workers lose their jobs. It's the only way how they kind of face or how they find out that transition is happening. And Žilnik kind of opens up through his films or through his filmic practice very diverse political positions. We saw some of them here, but also later through the films you would have constant like negotiations and learning, relearning from some of these workers that become, you know, actors in his film. So yeah, just wanted to say that there is no kind of, Žilnik doesn't give a plan or kind of exit, but he opens the field to the discussion that was missing at that point. So there is no exchange or there's no free market of ideas. There's just like one idea that is being carried out. And yeah, there are different resistances, and Žilnik kind of intervenes into this. So that would be from my side, maybe just like kind of ironic or paradoxical, you know, that Harun Farooqi was making film of like workers are living factories, some kind of trope through different movies of 20th century. one could also think of making a movie of workers enter the factory and don't want to leave, or they occupy factories. That could be also a wonderful filmic odyssey. But yeah, it's there is this, of course, contradiction between wanting to be exploited, right? Wanting to have dignified work, but still to be inside of capitalist exploitation, or not being exploited. And we know that this non-exploitation can be even more brutal than exploitation. But yeah, there is like little demand of abolishing the wage labor, but a lot of this context in post-socialist context were fighting for work. So that's
Thank you very much, Gal. Yes, this is what utopia means for each of these players. No, going back to the line of the factory is a kind of utopia in reality for them, at least in the movie. And Jonathan, do you have just a comment?
Just a couple of points, footnotes really. I imagine that some of the groups that were involved in the Heathrow event were either then or became Extinction Rebellion, which is, you may know as an organisation, it's a decentralised, I think it did start in England or the UK, and they recently, on Monday, they blocked the M25. I don't know whether you heard about that on the news, but they actually closed the M25 for about 3 hours. So it's and interestingly, the media coverage of it was that it was a renegade organisation or something, or a renegade part of this Extinction Rebellion. But in fact, there was a very interesting interview with one of the participants, also in the New Left Review recently, where he talked about the decentralized structure of it. And essentially, it is separate groups of people. There is no leadership to it, but they do agree, or they try to agree amongst themselves, these decentralized groups, about which actions to take and which not to take. So I think that was probably the misreporting that was going on from the media. For instance, that there was a few months ago, they tried, some members of Extinction Rebellion got on top of tube trains in London, and that apparently was an event that wasn't supported by lots of the other decentralized groups because of the effect that it had. Again, that was misreported as a renegade faction. But the other point I wanted to make was that although we've seen more of it today in our discussion later on with some of the papers, I think we had something of a gap between the ideological critique and the accounts of neoliberalism and the historiography and the kind of conceptual thinking of it, thinking through it, on the one hand, and this idea of social experience and social practice. But film, I think, provides an intermediate term, which is really about representation. And we haven't really talked about that, but not just representations in terms of films and things, also interpretation, hermeneutics. What we don't have is a kind of sociological hermeneutics of how neoliberalism worked, in inverted commas, through representations. So we can produce our own very sophisticated readings of films, and we've all got film theory to help us do it. But, if we're talking about the doxa and this idea that neoliberalism became common sense, I don't know whether Dimitris is still here or not, it presumably partly did that because of the way that people interpreted some of the representations of neoliberal ideas that were successful. But I can't really think of many studies that do that. And yet these films produce counterexamples where we could talk about how we interpret this opposition to neoliberalism. But I would like to see much more of that, much more work going into trying to understand over 40 years how, in what particular vehicles, representational vehicles, films or products, we did see some of that today, how that actually itself became cogitated within what we think of as the success of neoliberalism, because I don't think we have that at the moment.
Thank you. So we open to the floor right now because we have 12, 13, 15 minutes even. So I don't know if there are reactions, comments, questions to our speakers or something. regarding the movie. I think there are a lot of things that are connected to the discussions today. You know what Maria said about the 70s wanting to leave the factory and here asking to go back to the factory, no? And being the guy, he's completely moved, no? When he's talking about finally he can have a wage, no? And so this is something that is very, so yeah, Angela, thank you.
Thank you, Gal and Jonathan, for your reflections and for the films. Actually, it's quite interesting that the films you are showing, right, are from the late 90s, early 2000s, right?
2008, 2009.
Right, okay, 2008, 2009. So if I go back to kind of the immediate post-Soviet experience of the former USSR, like in a sense, and taking up kind of Gal's theoretical presentation, conceptual presentation of a collapse of utopia and dystopia, in a sense, onto each other. You effectively had a kind of not only an abolition of wage labor, but an abolition of labor as such. In a sense, kind of, 1968 utopia, abolition du travail somehow becomes reality, but other people's nightmare. And in the 90s, again, like you had this ultimate, deindustrialization, laborization in the immediate post-Soviet sphere, but also you had a different mode of economy emerging in its interstices when you were working, let's say, let's say factories were working 5% capacity. You're producing, I don't know, pants, underwear, and so on. And in exchange of your labor, you would be receiving the very products rather than wage. And this kind of economy also spilled over into the emerging art market. Let's say this Armenian curator Nazaret Kalerian establishes a private gallery, one of the first attempts to set up an art market in Armenia. And he doesn't have money to give to artists to produce work or to pay for their labor. So he gives them boxes of Marlboro cigarettes imported from the USA. So there is like a kind of a pre-modern barter economy, right? That is emerging in the aftermath of like demodernization of labor. So just a reflection, but of course it's an important discussion to open up of the mode of representation, right, of this post-Soviet and post-Yugoslav, post-socialist contradictions. And I think these films are important because they are rare examples of artists and filmmakers intervening into and representing discussions over labor, given the kind of the general amnesia within the contemporary art and film spheres in former Soviet and post-Soviet, post-socialist contexts, and their detachment, largely their detachment from the problematic of labor and factory work.